What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you an update on Baldur's Gate 3 following an announcement from Larian, including the major news about the moving of the release date from August 31st to August 3rd, at least on PC, which is an incredibly rare move. We don't see release dates brought forward very often, and to couple that news, they also gave us a bunch of more details about the game, which obviously we will get into, but as I said, this was a couple days ago. It took me a little longer than I would have necessarily liked to get this video done, but ultimately everything they announced besides the release date is mostly stuff we already knew was coming, so I wanted to handle some more time-sensitive things first. But to give a brief overview of everything that they announced, the release date, of course, some stats for the game in terms of numbers of passive hours it'll take to complete the game, things like that. The level cap officially is 12, the new race is coming, Dragonborn and Half-Orc, the monk class, new origin characters, companions, feats, spells, difficulty, and a few other things. So needless to say, we've got a fair amount of things to cover here, so let's dive right into it. As I mentioned, the release date for PC has been moved to August 3rd. However, for PS5, it is actually moved to September 6th, the day Starfield is releasing. However, Starfield is not releasing on PS5, so there's not really a conflict there, which I mentioned specifically because a few days ago I actually made a video about how the August 31st date was so close to the early access date for Starfield, which is September 1st, being a bit of an issue, I would say, for many people who would enjoy both. However, with this move, they've effectively removed that issue, which again is just very funny. It happened like maybe 3 or 4 days after I posted that video. Now, if you're wondering about Xbox, they are working on it. It is coming to Xbox, however, they are having some trouble getting this done. And my understanding was the issue was with getting co-op to work on the Series S, which is the weaker Xbox, and Xbox requires it to work on that as well. Now, honestly, that's the big news. Everything else we kind of already knew about to some degree because quite some time ago now, so something that is very understandably not at the forefront of people's mind, is that Larian Studios announced when they were making Baldur's Gate 3 that their goal was to put everything from the player handbook in the game in terms of options, which means that the things that were announced in this update were simply things that we hadn't yet seen from the player's handbook being added to the game, such as the Dragonborn race, the Half-Orcs, the monk class, etc. So again, stuff we knew was coming. Nonetheless, though, a couple of things in particular really stood out to me, and I have questions about their characterization. Now, obviously, I don't have the game in front of me, in its full form, mind you. Obviously, we have the early access version. But in part of this update, they mentioned that the game has 174 hours of cinematics. At least that is what I saw a lot of gaming news outlets run with. But if you actually read the update from Larian as published, it says Baldur's Gate 3 has more cinematic dialogue than 3 times all 3 Lord of the Rings novels combined. It has 174 hours of cinematics, making it more than twice the length of every season of Game of Thrones combined, which is certainly an impressive number. But when they say 174 hours of cinematics, I do have questions about how they're arriving at that number, because if they're counting every permutation of cinematic dialogue for a character who has tons of dialogue trees, yes, obviously that number is going to add up very, very quickly. And moreover, that scenario wouldn't really be the same as saying there's literally 174 hours of cinematics. So again, I'm just curious how they arrived at that number because it seems incredibly high. If they'd like to chime in, I would love to hear their clarification on that, or if they really mean 174 hours of cinematics. Either way, though, I do think it's going to be a massive game, so it's not that big of a deal. It just struck me as an odd number. The second thing that really stood out to me is in an interview that they put out like at the same time as this with, I believe, IGN, they talked about the length of the game with an average playthrough for most people running 75 hours to 100 hours and ballparking it around 200 hours if you wanted to see everything. The 200-hour thing sounds about right to me, and for many people, I'm sure these numbers will actually be pretty accurate. I just want to point out that there are tons of variance in this kind of thing. For instance, another CRPG, Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, people will often tell you takes over 100 hours to complete, and yet there's an entire live stream playthrough from me going through it in about about 60 hours. So that's a difference of 40 hours between what people are saying and what it might actually take someone to do. So while I'm sure it very will likely take people this long, I just wanted to point out that there's a lot of variance in that kind of thing, and why when it comes to talking about the hours it takes to do something in a video game, it's a tough subject to do accurately, because there are people who are going to play this game in wildly different ways, which come out to an amount of wildly different hours. Ultimately though, no matter how you slice those numbers, that is going to make for a massive game. Now let's get into the other things they announced. They announced that the level cap will be 12 officially. When the game was first announced, they said it was going to be 10, but they decided to raise this, though we didn't get the exact number, in order to accommodate some of the more interesting spells. Many times for D&D 5e, this has wound up being level 12, and most of the conversation, of which I did make a video about, was ballparking at around 12 or 14, which brings on new spell levels. We also knew that the level cap was never going to actually hit 20, which is the de facto max in D&D 5e, for a variety of reasons, but ultimately the level cap is going to be 12. I will say, however, though, that it is possible in the early access period, which is just like the first portion of the game, to very, very quickly get to level 5, like within a couple of hours if you know what you're doing, and without even really putting that much effort into it. So given this announcement and the length of the game, I have some questions that will ultimately have to wait until the game is in my hands to see about how long it's actually going to take to reach level 12 versus how much of the game is going to be left when you do. Because it's going to be feeling really strange if I hit level 12 before I'm even halfway through the game. But then again, that might be their intention. They might want you to spend some time at the max level and actually take part in some challenging encounters that way. So again, one of those things that's hard to really say until we see the full release, but it sounds interesting to be sure. Next up though, we have the confirmation of Dragonborn and Half-Orcs making it into the title. The Dragonborn, of course, being the dragon-like humanoids popular in the series, technically hailing from the sister world of Toril, which is where the Forgotten Realm setting is based on, but the Dragonborn hail from the sister world of Toril known as Abir, and come in many different variations of chromatic and metallic dragon types. This means that their sub-races are all different colors of dragon, which will decide what kind of resistance they get, as well as the type of damage their breath weapon will deal. But then we have the Half-Orcs. Half-Orcs are a great martial race. They get to deal extra damage with crits using triple the dice, and perhaps most usefully, they get the ability called Relentless Endurance, which means they can sort of cheat death once per long rest. Instead of going into the dying state, they will be instead just dropped to 1 HP. And then not a full-blown race, but they announced that the dwarves are getting a third sub-race with the Duragar. That is to say, the dark dwarves, if you will. And then they conveniently provided this sort of graphic outlining all of the launch races and sub-races that will be available, with Dragonborn, of course, getting the most simply because they get one for every color of dragon. But we're not done yet, because we get the addition of the monk class now. Now, I was actually really curious how they were going to implement this, because ultimately the monk is about either unarmed combat or using their key powers through weapons like a quarterstaff. And while I am very much so on the record not being a fan of monks in-game like this, for the same reason I don't really like them in Pathfinder, they are a lot of people's favorites, which means I'm happy to see them in the game. But they did announce that they did a lot of house ruling for this class to allow them to keep up next to the other classes, which is a bit of a problem in 5e, along with a few spell classes that allow them to specialize in either just straight up melee combat by charging their attacks with psychic, necrotic, or radiant damage, a shadow monk who's a bit more of a stealthy fighter, and then the 4 elements who can utilize monk variants of spells in addition to some melee action, so a bit of a Gish style of character. Overall though, very cool. They also provided a nice graphic here that shows off all the new subclasses and everything that are coming with the launch version of the game, which includes a new subclass for just about every single class here, including the addition of all of the specializations for the wizard, several more cleric domains, and some other interesting ones here and there. Now, as someone who plans on playing a warlock first time, I do have to say I was a little disappointed that we are not getting the Hexblade subclass for the warlock out of the gate, which would have made my life a lot easier, because there are ways to build essentially the same character with a warlock. It just requires you to take some different feats and stuff that I've already made a video on actually. But as a personal thing, kind of bummed not to see that one. Next up though, let's talk about some companions. We get the addition of an origin character with Karlach. Karlach is a character we already know. She is present in the early access period. She is a tiefling barbarian that hails from the 9 Hells, or more specifically Avernus, the first layer. She's going to be an origin character, which means you can play the game as her, and she will have a story directly tied to the main story. She's also available as a companion if you choose to make your own character, and she has, I would argue, one of the most interesting quests already in early access, which makes her addition here not a surprise, especially with some of the data mining we had already seen. Overall, though, very cool addition. However, they did also mention that she will not be the final origin character, despite that bringing it up to 6. Apparently, on their next panel from Hell, which is on July 7th, they will be announcing more, it would seem. And I'll be covering that as well, of course, in case you can't tune in for it yourself. Beyond that, though, we were also announced 4 companions who will be mostly romanceable. Companions will be people you can bring into your party, but are not origin characters, which means they are not playable. This includes Halsin the Druid, Jaheira, and Minsc from the previous Baldur's Gate games. Jaheira just having lived the 100 years since Baldur's Gate 2, and she is a half-elf who can live a very long time. Minsc, however, is a human. He was just turned into a statue for a while, and it's a whole thing. And then we have Minthara, the drow that we can also meet in early access. Now, honestly, the nice thing about some of these additions is that we finally see more of the good-aligned characters, or the, at the very least, neutral by comparison, because mostly up to this point, we've seen a lot of more, I would say, shady and evil-leaning characters, but with all these companions added, they finally are showing us some of the good companions, if you will, which will help balance everything out. Now, in addition to this, they went on to announce many of the new feats that will be coming to the launch version, many of the new spells that will be coming, which coincides with the new spell levels that we have yet to actually see in early access. So nothing too crazy here, just the spells you would expect to get at certain levels for spellcasters. And then, most interestingly, they talked about the difficulty levels. As this is a game based on D&D 5e, they want it to feel like the difficulty is essentially the DM adjusting the rolls in some way, which is honestly kind of a nice way to approach it. With that said, we know that early access is essentially just normal mode. That is what they are balancing the game around, and it is the default difficulty. Again, something we already knew, but needs to be stated, I would say. From there, they're going to make a story mode, which will just make the game easier, prices better, and give you better bonuses. Then there will be a hardcore mode, where enemies will prioritize easier to kill targets, will actually make a point to try to kill you, and will also have adjustments to individual fights made, including things like reinforcements and extra enemies to fight. So basically standard stuff you would expect from a difficulty like this. Though truth be told, this is something where I would like to see Larian take cues from Owlcat Games, because say what you will about Wrath of the Righteous and Kingmaker in terms of their difficulty and everything, but they really nailed the concept of a modular difficulty where you could adjust so many tiny things about the way the game worked. Even if the presets aren't for you, you can definitely find something that is. So in addition to what they've announced here, I really hope they go for that modular approach that we've been seeing in more recent days that I'm a really big fan of, especially with CRPGs, because I think things like that help clear the hurdle of entry for a lot of people, which is always a great thing. Now, they wrapped up this announcement by stating some things about the collector's edition, which is of interest to me because I've ordered one. Mainly that they will be emailing you the code so you can start the game on its actual release date, including the 72-hour early access period that comes with the more expensive versions of the game. Now, I mentioned that specifically because originally the collector's edition was not going to be doing that. You either had to wait for it to show up, assuming you hadn't already bought the early access. Because as it stands, even with the release date change, things like shipping and everything are already underway, so the collector's editions will still be arriving when they were originally supposed to, which is around the end of August. Not going to affect a ton of people, I would say, outside of the people who ordered the collector's edition, but I wanted to mention it nonetheless. Now, that, I think, just about covers everything that Larian talked about in this announcement, with more details to follow with their panel from Hell on July 7th. Now, I fully imagine that they will be showing all of this off in person alongside with the new details they hinted at in this announcement as well. So it looks like we'll have even more to cover about Baldur's Gate 3 during that final panel from Hell, which is probably the point where I will try to start ramping up content for this, if you will, talking about guides and things you can do in this game in particular. or just things people want to know as we get very close to the release date. Now, that said, that's pretty much everything important I have to say for this video. I do want to end this talking a little bit about how the review schedule is going to work for me, as I know a lot of people are curious to get my full thoughts on this game, as this is primarily a review channel. So with that in mind, my thinking is along the lines of probably what I did with Wrath of the Righteous, which is I made an initial review because I knew the game was going to take me an incredibly long time to 100%. For those who haven't been around that long, as at that time I only had like 20,000 subscribers, what I did for Wrath of the Righteous was I made an initial review based on a review copy I received, and then it took me about 2 months to 100% that game, and then I made the 100% review talking about some of the things that changed, etc. I expect something similar to happen here, with the caveat being that I don't know if I'm going to get a review copy for this game. It won't make a difference to me whether or not I do, despite having covered literally all of Larian Studios' games. They have not shown much interest in interacting with the channel, which is totally fine. I'm not entitled to anything. But my point is, I do not expect to get a review copy for this, which means the first video you see on the release version of this game from me is likely going to be during the early access for the regular launch, so like August 1st, basically. At which point I plan on doing one full run of the game and then deciding what to do from there. If it's a game I think I can 100% in a reasonable amount of time, then I will do so. If I think it's going to take much longer than that, I'll drop an initial review, followed by the 100% a little later down the line. But ultimately, we shall see. That's just kind of where my mind is at it right now. All of that said, I hope you found all this information useful. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're looking forward to learning about more of BG3 or my review or coverage of it, etc., by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.